be serving, as Shubhadeep mentioned, the curtain raiser for ICS's 15th flagship All India Conference of China Studies, which is set to begin tomorrow, that is 17th November 2022. I am Anushka Saxena, a research intern at ICS, and I shall be facilitating the seminar today. This seminar would focus on diverse agenda items pertaining to the developments from the 20th National Congress of the Communist Party of China, held for a week from the 16th to the 22nd of October 2022. The most notable development, aside from the anointment of Xi Jinping for an unprecedented third term as GS of the party, has been the stalking of the Politburo Standing Committee, the apex of political power in China, with his loyalists. Equally important have been pronouncements such as the shift of economic focus toward the Make in China 2025 campaign, which is descriptive of big picture formulations such as a statist domestic economic agenda and a much more mercantilist foreign policy agenda. With Xi's new era in place, the articulation of Xi Jinping thought at the 20th CPC Congress has also acquired a new sophistication and claimed more authenticity. In this light, without further ado, I'd like to introduce the panelists for this session, whose insights will carry the deliberations forward. Joining us as chair today is Dr. Alka Acharya. She is Honorary Director, Institute of Chinese Studies, and Professor, Center for East Asian Studies, School of International Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University. Joining us as speaker today is Ms. Shannon Tiezzi, who is the Editor-in-Chief of the Diplomat. Her main focus is on China, and she writes on China's foreign relations, domestic politics, and economy. Her presentation will be on the topic Xi's New Team. Joining us also as speaker is Dr. Manoranjan Mohanty. He was a professor of political science and director of Developing Countries Research Center at the University of Delhi, where he taught comparative politics, Chinese politics, and research methodology. His presentation will be on the topic Xi Jinping Thoughts for the New Journey. Joining us also as speaker is Professor David Schweik. He is Professor Emeritus, Hong Kong University of Science and Technology, and Distinguished Visiting Professor of Taipei School of Economics and Political Science, National Tsinghua University, Taiwan. His presentation will be on the topic The Path Not Taken. The complete bios of our speakers can be perused on the ICS website. Apart from the technical sessions of the technical details of the house, before we initiate the proceedings of the session, I request the audience to follow some housekeeping rules. All participants are requested to stay muted during the presentations. Questions and comments can be posed in the chat box at any time during the event, or one can raise their Zoom virtual hand during the interactive session. Please unmute yourself only when called upon by the chair or the facilitator to do so. I now hand over the floor to our chair, Professor Dr. Alka Acharya, to take the proceedings forward. Thank you.
Thanks, Anushka, for that very quick introduction to today's discussion. We were just talking before we formally began the proceedings, and Professor Mohanty was mentioning that how our All India Conference of China Studies, which is now, this is the 15th edition, has always added an outreach element because this is a conference which goes to different universities all over the country. And invariably, the interest in China is increasing, and our conferences are attracting a great deal of attention as well. And so we do normally have a public lecture where a scholar of repute is asked to deliver a lecture, maybe on the theme of the conference, but maybe also, as this time, on an event that has captured the imagination of a large number of scholars and students, China watchers all over. Today's curtain raiser is actually the beginning of the 15th AICCS, All India Conference of China Studies. And incidentally, also a Wednesday seminar, because it happens to be on a Wednesday seminar. So not the other way around, that it is a Wednesday seminar. But as we have communicated to our scholars who are participating in this conference, as well as to our audience in these seminars, the 20th Party Congress of the Communist Party has really been the talk subject of much debate, speculation, intense analysis for nearly a year. I don't think any other event has has made people so excited and so almost you know taking very contested kind of views as the 20th Party Congress has been. Now, for us, this inevitably became and very naturally became the outreach part of the AICCS, because we have seen that a large number of writings, particularly from the West, have tended to see this Congress primarily in terms of Xi Jinping and his ability to outmaneuver all the factional kind of infighting and emerge as the most powerful man in China today. And not only did he manage to outmaneuver, he also in the process went against the norms of the tenure of the president that had been in place since the turn of the century. And that then has led to speculation about how this strong man is now going to lead a much more assertive China into the further into the 21st century. Voices from Asia, however, have not taken such drastic views, although we do see perspectives on Xi Jinping's emergence as one of the most powerful leaders. But voices from Asia have been a bit more nuanced. They have focused variously on the ideological debates, the implications for the party's legitimacy, what really is the internal party dynamics all about? Is it just about factional power struggle, or is it also about debates about where China is going? And I think what we need to do at this point is understand China from also within its own debates and its own discourses. And the three scholars today who will be speaking on three different aspects of the 20th Party Congress are precisely those who have attempted to give different perspectives and different views. And it would be very, very interesting to bring these together and see whether we can actually emerge with an understanding which can help us navigate the discourse, not so much as understand China thoroughly, but at least give us some means to be able to contest or question or interrogate the dominant perspectives. And I think that's really an important part of the way in which we study China. So with those few words, I would like to, our speaker has arrived. Welcome, Professor Zhuig. We were waiting for you. So just in time to listen to our first speaker, Shannon. Floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Acharya. Thank you to the ICS and to the All India China Conference for inviting me. I'm very pleased to be able to take part in this virtual discussion today. As Dr. Acharya noted, the 20th Party Congress was of huge interest to observers around the world. One joke said that it was the China Watchers Olympics. Such was its significance and the relative rarity. This only happens once every 5 years. Every party Congress is important because they set the tone for China's governance and policy for the next 5 years. And so I think it's the perfect topic for a curtain raiser, because whatever issue you are interested in with regards to China, whether it's China's technology ambitions, China's foreign policy course, China's economic growth, China's bid to rework the international order, the Party Congress is going to have major implications for each of those topics and so many more. This year, I think the interest was even more heightened, if that's possible, because more was at stake. The tradition, although a relatively new tradition, admittedly, of the CCP General Secretary relinquishing power after a 10-year term, was about to be broken. And everybody knew this because Xi Jinping had previously amended the PRC constitution to ensure that the presidency was no longer term limited to 2 5-year terms. And that was a very clear signal that he was going to try to keep the general secretary of the Chinese Communist Party position, which is really the top position of political power in China, for more than 10 years. But even though we knew or assumed that Xi Jinping was going to be reanointed general secretary, China watchers were still very interested to see just how far his influence would reach, particularly looking at the Politburo Standing Committee, which is the apex of political power in China. It's currently 7 men. It had fluctuated in the past a little bit, but still at 7 for right now. I'm going to assume that anyone who's tuning into this panel knows already the result. The Politburo Standing Committee is stacked with Xi Jinping loyalists. Beyond their personal connections to Xi, what do we actually know about the 6 men who are joining him on the PSC? What could they tell us about policy proclivities and China's future direction? That's what I'm going to be examining a little bit in my presentation. So the number 1 is obviously Xi Jinping himself, the General Secretary of the CCP, sometimes referred to as the chairman of everything, because he does take direct leadership of pretty much every leading small group in the Chinese Communist Party. Number 2 is Li Qiang, formerly the party secretary of Shanghai, and he is presumed to be the next premier of China. But there are several of the positions that have not been awarded yet. The state-side positions will not actually be made official until the meeting of the National People's Congress coming in March. Number 3 is Zhao Leji, who is presumed to be the National People's Congress chair, although again, that won't be made official for some months yet. And following him is Wang Huning, presumed to be the CPPCC chair. And those 2, Zhao and Wang, are both holdovers from the previous Politburo Standing Committee, along with Xi Jinping. The number 4 is Cai Qi, who is the head of the CCP Central Committee Secretariat. He was formerly the party secretary of Beijing. Following him, Ding Xuexiang, who is presumed to be the executive vice premier once those appointments are made. And Ding was formerly known as Xi Jinping's chief of staff, although that wasn't his technical title. And finally, rounding out the group of 7, we have Li Qiang, the party secretary of Guangdong, who is now the secretary of the Central Commission for Discipline Inspection. Now, if you're just looking at this on paper and you've been removed from all the context about factions, their credentials might look fairly typical, with the possible exception of Ding Xuexiang, who I'll get back to in a moment. On the 7-member lineup, you have 3 previously sitting Politburo Standing Committee members, Xi Jinping, Zhao Leji, and Wang Huning. You also have the party secretaries of Shanghai, Beijing, and Guangdong, which are 3 of the most important regions in China. But as many analysts have already pointed out, several of these new Politburo Standing Committee members skip steps in the traditional career trajectory. And that is without even getting into the question of who didn't make it onto the Politburo Standing Committee. Most notably Wang Yang, who was a sitting Politburo Standing Committee who lost his seat despite being age eligible to stay on. And if you're looking for evidence of Xi Jinping breaking institutional norms within the party to advance his own personal hold on power, that's Exhibit A, that this traditional age limit rule was broken or bent to allow Xi to ease Wang Yang, who is not part of his faction, off the Politburo Standing Committee. Another surprise omission was Hu Chunhua, who was a former Politburo member and vice premier who was once seen as a rising political star. And not only did he not make it onto the Politburo Standing Committee, he didn't even retain his seat on the Politburo. So that is another clear signal that being in the wrong faction is now basically a career ender at the top of the top elite level of Chinese politics. So let's take a look at the career trajectories of some of these new Politburo Standing Committee members. As I said, Ding Xuexiang is unusual because he has never had a provincial level party secretary position, which makes him something of an odd choice to wind up on China's top party governing body. What he does have going in his favor is that Ding served as Xi Jinping's personal secretary from 2013 to 2017. And then he was often known as Xi Jinping's chief of staff while Ding was serving as the head of the general office. So it's a sign of Xi's immense influence over the party that, given his close personal connection, Ding Shuisheng was widely expected to be on the Politburo Standing Committee, even though he had not held a provincial level party secretary position before. Cai Qi was a bit more of a surprise, but perhaps he shouldn't have been. His elevation to the Politburo Standing Committee continues what had previously been a meteoric rise. Cai has worked together with Xi Jinping in Fujian and Zhejiang provinces, and he has a long history of being rapidly promoted by Xi. Between 2013 and 2017, Cai was promoted 4 times in those 4 years, culminating in him being made party secretary of Beijing, even without having previously served on the Communist Party's Central Committee, which was, again, unusual. So as party secretary of Beijing, Cai was well positioned to make it onto the Politburo Standing Committee. So that may already have been a done deal, even though us outsiders were a bit surprised by it. Li Qiang, as the party secretary of Shanghai, was one of the most obvious inclusions on the Politburo Standing Committee, in keeping with tradition. Every Shanghai party secretary since Xi Jinping himself in 2007 has made it onto the Politburo Standing Committee. So most people expected Li to be there. But his ranking, number 2, which strongly suggests that he's going to be China's next premier, did come as a surprise. And the news leaked a few days in advance, and many China analysts were a bit flabbergasted by this, because the premier has typically served a previous stint as vice premier, and Li Qiang has not. In fact, he has not held any office at the central national level. So taken all together, to most analysts, the selection of the Politburo Standing Committee emphasizes loyalty and familiarity and trust by Xi Jinping over experience. As those examples indicate, in several places, not having the traditionally required political experience does not preclude these men from being promoted. Clearly, their relationships with Xi are more important. And that sets the tone for Xi Jinping's new era. He clearly wants men who will enforce his decisions, and not technocrats who are going to make policy decisions of their own. So to return to Dr. Acharya's comments about ideological debates within the party, some have argued this means there are no ideological debates, that everything is settled. China's direction is Xi's direction. I think that is overly simplistic. We should not conclude that these new Politburo Standing Committee members have no agency, or that their backgrounds and their policy preference don't matter. And I think the case of Li Qiang's handling of Shanghai's COVID-19 outbreak is an instructive example. But to really understand what it tells us, we need to go back to the beginning. Early in 2022, before the lockdown that became so famous in international media, Shanghai was actually known within China for taking a relaxed approach to Xi Jinping's zero COVID policy. Shanghai avoided full lockdowns for far longer than any other major Chinese city. It was effectively operating as business as usual, because Li Qiang had emphasized the economic importance of Shanghai. And that suggests that as party secretary, Li Qiang was being given leeway to do a little bit of policy experimentation within the bounds of this greater zero COVID framework. Now, obviously, that all changed with the major COVID-19 outbreak that began in early March 2022. But it didn't change immediately. They began their phased lockdown nearly a month after the outbreak really kicked into high gear. Cases reached over 130,000 by April 8th. That was several days before the government finally announced a total lockdown of the entire city. They had been trying to do progressively strict piecemeal operations before that. So this policy course suggests that Li Qiang was trying to find flexibility in implementing Xi's zero COVID goal, and that he was allowed that flexibility up to a certain limit. When it became clear that he would have to choose either continuing to emphasize the economy or strictly implementing zero COVID, of course, he chose Xi Jinping's side. And he chose to institute a harsh lockdown of Shanghai to show his fealty for zero COVID. And that, ironically, is what everyone remembers him for now. Everyone remembers Li Qiang as the man who oversaw Shanghai's COVID-19 lockdown and seems to have forgotten the more permissive approach that some of Li Qiang's critics say arguably caused the outbreak in the first place. So what does this story and Li's leapfrog promotion to the #2 slot on the Politburo Standing Committee tell us? I would argue that this tells us Xi's trusted hands may actually have more leeway on the policy measures than we have previously assumed. Remember, Li Qiang originally decided that keeping Shanghai's enormous economy functioning was more important than strictly implementing zero COVID lockdowns. And Li actually has fairly deep economic experience, albeit only at the provincial level. He's previously served as the party secretary of Jiangsu and province, and before that, the governor of Zhejiang. And these are two of China's wealthy coastal provinces, very economically important. Obviously, Shanghai is as well. This means he may be a more economically friendly premier than people might assume if you think of him only as Xi Jinping's man. In fact, some people have argued that he's too economically friendly because his career is concentrated in those wealthy coastal provinces. He may lack understanding of the plight of some of China's poor inner provinces or the Rust Belt to the north. But from his days in Jiangsu and Zhejiang in particular, many foreign observers saw him as pro-business, as pragmatic, as someone that foreign investors could work with. So my thought would be that he may actually be a more typical pro-business, pro-economy premier in the Chinese context than people would expect. And that Xi Jinping might allow this because he trusts Li Qiang. He trusts that when push comes to shove, Li's political loyalty is going to win out, as it did in Shanghai when Li Qiang pivoted from being more flexible to arguably over-enforcing zero COVID policies in Shanghai, even at the expense of widespread criticism within the city. So Xi Jinping will know that any policy flexibility is within strict limits. And frankly, that's not much different from Li Qiang as premier. Li Qiang, even though he was not within Xi Jinping's faction, was not about to directly defy the top man's policy diktats. And Li Qiang may actually have more room to maneuver because ultimately Xi trusts that he won't stray too far, whereas Li Qiang had to be constantly watched to make sure that he wasn't undermining the top man. So ultimately, I think we do need to look at the personal loyalty that these men have to Xi Jinping is their defining political characteristic at this moment in time. And looking back at the longer arc of party politics, it's clear that even in 2017, Xi was positioning his allies to be in line for promotions to the Politburo Standing Committee. And he may have simply wanted to push through with that. So in a sense, it may not have mattered what Li Qiang did as party secretary of Shanghai from 2017 to 2022. Once he was placed in that position in 2017, as I said, it would be unusual if the party secretary of Shanghai didn't make it onto the Politburo Standing Committee. If Xi wanted these men on the PSC because of their personal relationships to him, then it probably would have taken clear evidence of disloyalty rather than so-so governance to prevent them from getting the promotions that Xi had in mind for them all the way back in 2017. So where does this leave us going forward if Xi Jinping has essentially eliminated rival factions from the elite politics in the Chinese Communist Party? Well, as Yang Zhang at American University has argued, this doesn't mean an end to factional politics in the CCP. If we look back at the history of the Mao Zedong era or the Deng Xiaoping era, strongman rule at the top is not going to prevent new factions from forming. Rather, we can expect those factions to form and compete to show their loyalty to the top leader. So we should be looking for new factions to emerge, although this process will take some time, from within what's often called the new Zhejiang army or Xi Jinping's personal faction. And we can again think of the way that CCP power and factional jostling worked under Mao or Deng. Everyone brands himself as a loyalist, but they're fighting against each other to be seen as more loyal to win favor. Now, this will probably entail fights over the best way to implement Xi's vision, but that could actually entail real policy differences. For example, Xi Jinping has a strong focus on innovation, on making China into a global technology power. Everyone beneath him is going to have to agree with that general line. But how you do it could be completely divergent. Do you emphasize innovation by seeking a stronger role for the market, by seeking more foreign cooperation and investment? Or do you emphasize innovation by boosting state control over the economy, by boosting the state's ability to set the direction for what every private company is doing? You could make a case for either one. And these are the battles that we're going to need to watch going forward. I think it's very clear that Xi Jinping's policies directions are going to win the day, but how to implement them and who is setting the tone for how to implement them is going to be very interesting to watch. So I will leave my presentation here and very much look forward to hearing the thoughts of our other scholars.
Thank you, Shannon. That was really a very, very interesting, insightful, and although this word is used, overused, but I think it has a very specific relevance in this particular context, a very nuanced snapshot that you have given us of Xi's men. And in particular, the point that you have made is that this is a trusted group. I mean, you can use the term loyalist or you can use the term Xi's men and so on, but this is a group of men Xi Jinping trusts. And what we are looking at this point is that this is not just an ordinary year, it is China coming out of the COVID situation. The challenges have mounted over the last 3 years. And clearly going forward, he would, and you know, the question that is implicit in what you have said is that every new leader seeks to build his own team of trusted men, and why not? But what you brought out, which is very interesting, is that that does not preclude debates within, does not preclude policy differences which could be aired, as long as they are all working towards the goals that Xi Jinping is setting out, the new era and its demands. I think after the 60s, when the struggle between the two lines was posited as one of, you know, antagonistic contradiction. Since then, we have seen differences, policy differences, policy debates, which are all focused on how do you interpret socialism with Chinese characteristics. I mean, that has broadly been the rubric. So, so this is not an end to factionalism, not the way in which people are looking at Xi, chairman of everything. It's not something that is set in stone. So it'll be really interesting to see how this works out. Thank you, Shannon, for that. And I now turn to our next speaker, Professor Zweig. Over to you, sir.
Mute myself. Okay, so I apologize for being late in joining this group, largely because of daylight savings time. So thank you for contacting me. I actually, and I also want to comment that I just really enjoyed Shannon's comments. This has already been worth joining and participating just to hear those comments, because I thought they were terrific, though I will have 1 or 2 comments that I want to make later. I'm going to try a non-traditional screen sharing, and let me know if this is working. Is that okay? Can you see? Can you see my, not
Yes, sir,
my
we can see the
slides?
screen.
Yeah,
Yes.
this is a new way. I'm not spending the hours. This is a new strategy, not spending the hours of fitting everything into this silly PPT, but in fact, you can just do it this way. So I thought I'd talk about the 3 T's, technology, talent, and Taiwan, in reflecting on the 20th Party Congress. And the reason I use this format is because I've got a lot of quotes. Now, first thing I want to talk about is a technology-driven foreign policy. You know, I mean, I wasn't supposed to talk about the domestic economy so much, but this all is so intricately connected. We can go back to 2013, where we were all very excited about this market reform program that was first put forward at the third plenum, and it was the 60 points of reform, and everybody thought, wow, this is amazing. It's, you know, it's time, here we go. We haven't had any reform since the end of the Zheng era, 1997. This is it. Wow, China's gonna make it into the market economy. Well, we turned out wrong. And that same summer, they had started to move forward on what eventually became Made in China 2025, and a very heavy-handed industrial policy with lots of investment in what Shannon had mentioned, sort of this technologically driven policy. And I like to refer to that as the path not taken. You know, the sort of this incredible divergence. If we look back at 2013, Barry Naughton would say maybe it was even earlier, but for me, it was very clear that at that point, there were 2 totally different strategies on the table, and Made in China 2025 won. And that really has led to this industrial policy and a very strong mercantilist foreign policy, buying firms overseas. I mean, maybe even the Belt and Road could be seen as part of it. But the idea of bringing back technology factories, and we see this right now with the issue of the German factory that China is trying to buy a chip making factory, right? And buy this technology, bring it back to China, and increase China's share of the value added for these technology products rather than being the final assembly point. And this really gives us a clear sense of the close links between domestic development and foreign policy, particularly under Xi, which is linked again to this highly mercantilist international political economy. Now, if you look at the 20th Party Congress, among the 15 sections among the report, 5 of them incorporate the idea of technology, including sections on the CCP's new mission, economic development, science and technology and education, domestic security, and military and defense. And things like technology is the key to the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation and the China dream. So now, while only 1 paragraph from the 19th Party Congress report talked about the innovation-driven development strategy, Xi added a whole section to elaborate on invigorating China, quote, invigorating China through science and education and developing a strong workforce for the modernization drive. The report includes 55 mentions of the word technology, increasing from 25 mentions in the 19th Party Congress report. I think that part of this is Xi knows that he's basically at war. I wrote this piece a couple years ago in the Financial Times. People were talking about the Cold War. This isn't, I mean, one component of the Cold War is the technology war. And we see China and the United States really building up for this technology war. And Xi in the presentation even talks about external attempts to suppress and contain China may escalate. And I think to a certain extent that's pretty clear now with the CHIPS bill, that a large part of that is the technological confrontation. As she said, we must speed up technological progress and self-reliance. We must pool our resources and focus on key areas to achieve breakthroughs so that we can win the race, not just be right there at the finish line with the US, but I thought it was interesting, win the race in core technologies critical to our national strategy. Now, again, no mention of Made in China 2025. That's verboten, as we say. Das ist verboten. We cannot talk about it, but the policies are the same. And as I said, it really shows that it affects the relationship with Germany, right? So this kind of technological drive, I mean, it's all over foreign policy, right? It's over the chips bill with the United States. It's over this microchip factory with Germany. The prime minister of Germany is about to come, right? And all of a sudden, what's everybody talking about? Technology, right? So it's really very much in the forefront of China's foreign policy, which you actually asked me to talk about. The second is actually the whole question of talent. And this is actually my area of expertise, just finishing up my book on China's search for talent. Previous leaders, in particular Deng Xiaoping, but also Jiang Zemin, and then 3 Politburo members who were working with Hu Jintao, all emphasized the importance of getting overseas talent, sending people out and bringing them back, right? And Xi Jinping, from my perspective, has been much more inward looking. Even introducing policies to control the reverse migrants and prevent them from becoming an internal threat or opposition. So for many years, the CCP slogan, going back to 1993, the CCP slogan for managing return talent was encourage people to go abroad, encourage them to return, and give them the freedom to come and go, which was a very liberal policy in the wake of Tiananmen. And the panic that had hit mainlanders who were living overseas. And then Xi himself added the importance of 4 more characters, what he called 发挥作用, right? Manifest their utility. In other words, the people who are back, let's take advantage of them rather than emphasizing bringing back more people. In 2016, a new policy was introduced where all returnees were supposed to join the Western Returnees Scholars Association, and that association was put under the control of the United Front Work Department of the CCP Central Committee. And that went down to the grassroots, because I did interviews down in the grassroots, right? But I think that showing Xi's flexibility somewhat on this, all the pressure that's been coming from the United States on talent and technology, we start to see Xi changing his tune a little bit, right? I wanted to make that just a little, changing his tune, right? Because he needs the breakthroughs in technology and to compete with the US. And back in November, just a year ago, he started to emphasize the importance of what I would call transnational talent that's spent time abroad and bringing them back. And I think he continued this emphasis at the 20th Party Congress. Now, again, Xi mentioned the term talent 36 times in that speech. This is statistically significant compared to the 5 times in 2017. He emphasized the need to follow a strategy of building a powerful country based on talent. Officials at all levels were encouraged to improve the country's ability to vastly expand its talent pool and attract foreign professionals to work in China, that this is the key to the country's technological self-reliance and national unification. Slogans like talent is the first resource, which we've actually heard for a long time. The party constitution was revised to include the idea for talents being brought back from overseas. But again, this is Xi Jinping, so the emphasis on talent, he wants talent that's patriotic and virtuous, right? Not equating that to the question of skill. So this is still Xi. And talent will be coming from all over the world. I just am, given the fact of what we've seen from Xi before, I'm just not sure how much emphasis he's going to put on bringing back people from overseas and trusting them, though 7 members of the Politburo have spent time overseas. Li Qiang at Brookings has pointed this out. 7 members, I think, of the Politburo have at least spent a year abroad, which is really quite remarkable for China. But he's talking about high quality professionals from around the world, joint missions. It's a joint mission for the education system, science and technology, and human resources. Now, some of the quotes that I pulled out. By 2030, a talent system that can adapt to the needs of high quality development and basically formed, and our ability to independently train innovative talents will have significantly improved, and attraction to world-class talents will have been significantly enhanced. So he's still talking 2 terms from now. We will expand science and technology exchanges and cooperation, cultivate an internationalized environment for research, right, and create an open and globally competitive innovation ecosystem. So this gives the sense of the openness to the outside world for people to try and attract people to come back. We will move faster to build world hubs for talent and innovation, promote better distribution and balanced development of talent across the regions, and strive to build out comparative strengths in global competition for talent. So here's a kind of global viewpoint. Still, I think there's some emphasis on the homegrown. And an article in the Diplomat talked about the CCP recognizing the importance of international cooperation, and Xi proposed to expand science and technology exchanges and cooperation with other countries if the Americans, one could argue, if the Americans will let him do that, right? Now, the third T is Taiwan. And since I lived in Hong Kong for 25 years, I thought I would sneak in my own little critique, since this is in India and I don't have to be worried about getting in trouble under the national security law. I think that China's making some big mistakes on the question of Taiwan at the sort of the cross-straits relations, separate from the United States and military. First of all, the claiming of the victory for the policy of one country, 2 systems in Hong Kong is really silly. It was not a victory. But it shows that under one country, 2 systems, if you're Taiwanese and you're looking out, what it tells you is that China is going to encroach on the autonomy promised to Taiwan, just like they did in Hong Kong. I mean, they lasted a long time. You know, we had 25 good years, but there was always a battle. There was always efforts to encroach on Hong Kong, right, and get more control over Hong Kong by the central government, right? And so if you're a Taiwanese and you're looking out, you're going to know that China is going to push for one country much more than 2 systems if you set up that kind of system. Quotes, we have helped Hong Kong enter a new stage. Restored order, yes, but part of the reason that there wasn't order was also China's fault. We've seen both Hong Kong and Macau maintain good stability. Put forward an overall policy framework for resolving the Taiwan question. There's no one in Taiwan who wants one country, 2 systems, or almost nobody, right? That goes back to the days of Li Denghui, when we interviewed him, and he said, "What do you mean, one country, 2 systems?" He says, you know, Tong Chi-hua, who was then the first chief executive, never does anything without phoning Beijing, right? And then it gets even, I think, a little sillier. We have resolutely opposed separatist activities aimed at Taiwan independence and foreign interference. I wanted to get to this quote, just to move forward. This is directed solely, the use of force, at interference by outside forces and the few separatists seeking Taiwan independence and their separatist activities, by no means targeted at Taiwan compatriots. Well, sorry, Xi Jinping, but your Taiwan compatriots largely want a high level of autonomy, if not independence. And you're not going to get them to come around if you don't at least offer maybe even back off on Hong Kong, which is not going to happen, but at least offer an incredible degree of autonomy and convince people that the one country, 2 systems actually means that there will be 2 systems rather than eventually you're going to impose one country. So in conclusion, I would say that Xi is a man in a hurry. for the great rejuvenation of China, for the greatness which in his mind will come, as Shannon said, by speeding up technological development. It's all in on technological development. It's all in on talent. I would say he did talk a lot about security, but I didn't want to talk about everything. I thought these 3 points were really enough. One thing Shannon didn't mention, which I think sort of jumped out, a lot of his goals are actually set for 2035. Now, does that mean that he feels comfortable that he's put a group in power that will carry through his policies to 2035? Or I'll let Shannon think about this. Is he really thinking that he wants to try and stay for 2 to 3 more terms, which would really be a surprise, I think, but who knows, Biden's still in there pushing away and Trump's running again. Now on the American side, China's pushing. On the American side, they want status quo, but what that really means is the US staying ahead of China. And that means, to a certain extent, making it very difficult for China to attain what Xi really has as his 3 goals, or 3 of his key goals, which are the core of my talk, which is, technology, chips, talent, the China initiative to stop stop a lot of the transfer by individual scientists across the border, and Taiwan, which is basically, you can't have it unless generally it's going to be a very hard time. So coming out of the meeting that the two had, they talked about the need for responsible competition, but I think the next 6 months, next year, next couple of years will tell whether in fact they can be responsibly competitive. So I'll stop there.
Well, thank you indeed. That was really opening up yet another set of this 20th Party Congress, which is in terms of the external interface. I think this tripod, the 3 Ts, is actually a really good handle to start to understand Xi Jinping's external objectives and challenges and his priorities.
Yeah, there still is the question of, just to add a brief second, because I can never stop talking. There's trade and the Belt and Road, and there's still other things. But I thought that it's okay.
There's yet another T, Tibet, which is also, quite full of challenges. But certainly, I mean, what you've really brought out very well are the challenges that Xi Jinping senses from the chief strategic competitor, which is the United States, and how he is trying to now position himself. So in one sense, it actually takes on from what Shannon was also arguing about how this group of men who he is going to rely on are really going to be in sync with the kind of challenges that Xi Jinping perceives coming out from outside, and therefore the need for a much more stronger core group that is navigating these challenges. On Taiwan, I have a slightly different take, Professor, but this is not the time or the occasion. And I think we will now turn to our third speaker, Professor Mohanty, who I'm sure is going to get ideology right back into the heart of things. Over to you, Manu.
Hi. Great to join this discussion after David. And good to see you, David. After Hanover, I think we are meeting here.
Yeah.
Well, 2 very interesting formulations. They really constitute a very important perspective. And underlying those 2 perspectives, one on personnel and politics, another on the how they want to reach the 2035 goal, not only through Make in China 2025, but really the modernization goal of 2035, and the mid-century goal, the second centenary goal. Underlying this is a set of ideas which bring them together. And that is what I'm going to talk about, namely the ideological perspective governing Xi Jinping's strategy of not only remaining in power, but leading China to a new stage of development. While a new era has been noticed, everybody is talking about Xi and Xi leadership in the new era. Another term that I know the 20th Party Congress used is hardly noticed. That is the new journey. And that new journey, the Party Congress report says, is the journey till 2049 with the 2035 marker. And in this new journey, what role does ideology play? And the ideology is Xi Jinping thought. Now, I have 2 points to make. Reflecting on the 19th Congress formulation on Xi Jinping thought on socialism with Chinese characteristics, socialism with Chinese characteristics in the new era. In the book that we produced on the 19th Party Congress, China at a Turning Point, I had criticized Xi Jinping thought the way it was formulated as an empiricist listing of several points, the so-called 8 affirmations and 14 points of points of attention. Now Xi Jinping in his report refers to 10 affirmations. I think because they were not enumerated, one could split them into 10 also. The 8-14 formulation that I noticed, or now we can revise it to say the 10 affirmations, 14 constants, is only a listing of several policy objectives in different spheres. It was not a sharp articulation of an ideology, like Mao Zedong thought about new democratic revolution and class struggle in a socialist period, or Deng Xiaoping theory as reform and open door, or socialism with Chinese characteristics, or market socialism and so on. You can pinpoint a certain 2 or 3 core principles. Amazingly, and this is the first point that I want to make, the 20th Party Congress report reaffirms the 10 affirmations and 14 what they call commitments. In other words, the 10-14 framework is reaffirmed. And they say that add to that the 19th Party Central Committee 6th plenum formulations. And together they talk about 10 affirmations, 14 commitments, and 13 areas of achievement. An ideological statement doesn't list like that. But yet, I see now some reaffirmation of the ideological statement. And that's what I call a little more sophistication in the articulation of the Xi Jinping thought. In analyzing the earlier formulations, I had said that they could be reduced to 3 things. One, a principal contradiction between uncoordinated, inadequate, imbalanced development versus people's rising expectations, okay, for good life, etc. So that is one. And then the party-led national rejuvenation, that is two. And several of these formulations you can put under them. And the third is the global perspective, the global strategy of, now it is all put in the frame of, the human community with shared future, that framework, with the addition of, Xi Jinping thought on diplomacy in the new era, and so on. The point I want to make is that the way they have now used ideology is to identify a broad perspective, that here is a leader who has a set of ideas. It is still, described as basic strategies, policies, and ideas. In other words, many things constitute Xi Jinping thought. But more importantly, now they have sectoral formulations called Xi Jinping thought on this sector, Xi Jinping thought on ecological civilization, Xi Jinping thought on culture, Xi Jinping thought on party building, Xi Jinping thought on diplomacy, and so on. In other words, you can very clearly identify the new strategy or formulation. So that is the sort of the additional sophistication they have added to the articulation, and all this appears also in the amended party constitution. So this is one point. In other words, you can see that at this point there is a policy consensus on certain approach to handling sectoral interventions, and that is now identified with Xi Jinping, and that is described as Xi Jinping thought. And but all this is subject to, seeking truth from facts, which is also reiterated, making Marxism relevant to the demand of the times, which is reiterated and spelled out in so many words, and so on. There is a whole section doing this, but every section has that sectoral formulation of Xi Jinping thought in that sector. So this is the first point. The second point, which follows the two presentations you have heard already, is about what function does this ideology play. In my view, it plays four major functions: legitimation, centralized or directed governance, centralized governance, then crisis management, and the great power ambitions or the global strategy. Legitimation. The two establishes which have been incorporated, or the two upholds, no matter how you translate those. That is respecting the core leadership of Xi Jinping, and second, respecting the party center and its decisions at every level, in every sphere. Now, but more than that, that these are referred to as the problem-solving approach. These are put in the context of many long-standing problems having been attempted and resolved or on the way of resolution during the last 10 years. And showing that they have achieved results, yet there are problems in each sector. So the legitimation strategy is very much tied to this. Therefore, ideology as very much rooted in practice. In other words, it's not, and again, it is stated that ideology, Marxism is not a dogma. So the, that rootedness is cited to legitimatize these policies. And, the sectoral policies which have been spelled out, they're presented as legitimate policies flowing from Xi Jinping thought, but Xi Jinping thought itself is the result of the practice of so many years, particularly last 10 years, 5 years of corrections, 5 years of initiatives. Those two terms of Xi Jinping are now described like that. The second is centralized governance. The to uphold says is very clear, and this is where there is a whole section about it says, after studying the rise and fall of parties and socialist systems, they have come to this understanding. And this is how Xi Jinping thought is presented. And the party-led governance and the party being present in every sphere of society is justified in that. And so the centralized governance is explained as the guarantee for preventing a Soviet-like collapse. You see that, the life and death problems that first Jiang Zemin talked about in reference to party and corruption. Then Hu Jintao again and again talked about, and that's how his scientific outlook on development emerged as a method, to address all these problems and come up with the 5-sector integrated strategy, which now becomes the new development philosophy under Xi Jinping. And that is part of the essential principles of Xi Jinping thought. And this high quality development, which is resting on both technology and talents that David Zweig talked about. This high quality development is key to the Chinese ambition of modernization, as well as the modern socialist country that they want to be, strong, prosperous, modern socialist country that they want to be by 2049. And the third is crisis management. And, there is a whole list of crises, problems within the party, economic institutions having a lot of problems, unsustainability, then a lot of people talking about things which show lack of faith in socialism or the Chinese system, then misguided patterns of thinking, money worship, hedonism, egocentrism, historical nihilism, that is denying achievements of the past and so on, or recognizing mistakes of the past. Then, in the report, Xi Jinping refers to online discourse was rife with disorder and grave problems existing in society and so on. I mean, there is a frank admission of so many of these problems. So this crisis management through ideology, as well as substantive intervention, as well as leadership initiatives, is very important. All three things: substantive in policy intervention, leadership initiatives, as well as ideological initiatives. This is where ideology is very important in crisis management, whether it is the zero COVID policy becoming part of the Xi Jinping leadership strategy, whether it is factionalism within the party or corruption, and the global challenges like in Taiwan, the provocations over Taiwan and so on, or the so-called security threat in Hong Kong and so on. So crisis management also is related to matters of ideology. This is a point we very often miss. Finally, the great power ambition is also connected with this, because here today the G20 came out with a statement which shows that they're divided. But there is a global consensus on a few things. Peace, disarmament, preventing nuclear war, then trying to tackle climate change, and so on. And the post-COVID world, our Prime Minister talked about a new world order in the post-COVID situation, and so on. And the shared destiny, the human community's shared destiny. And incidentally, the Indian motto for the G20 next year in India is one earth, one family, one future. Very much in tune with the Chinese frame. But all these things, and this is my comment on the entire ideological point, the great power ambition takes you to growth focus. That justifies using BRI, Belt and Road Initiative, using your technology policy, using competition with the United States, all for becoming a great power. But what happens to socialist modernization in all respects, national rejuvenation in all respects, political, social, economic, cultural, and ecological, all respects? In my view, this kind of use of ideology without grassroots democracy, without participatory rights, substantive participatory rights, without free debates, without, the common prosperity, for example, is a part of these principles. But and inequality is discussed, and mostly it is regional disparity and urban-rural inequality. But income disparity reduction is not a big goal. It is the middle class expansion that is the big goal, just like the Western European strategy. Therefore, I find that Xi Jinping thought still has some loose ends about ultimate socialist goals of equality and the environmental goals. Of course, there is this ecological civilization goal, but that is still not possible within the beautiful society, beautiful country, and all the nature and human harmony. All those are very much part of this statement, but the policies as they are in practice may not be hospitable to such goals of socialism and ecological socialism particularly, and egalitarian goals of socialism in particular. Thus, Xi Jinping thought has to grow even more to achieve socialism and a modern socialist country in all respects as far as the goal for 2049 is concerned. Thank you very much.
All right. Yes, as expected, Manu did take us to the heart of the matter, which is really about what do we make of this ideology? And frankly, Manu, after listening to you, it becomes even more apparent that there is a poverty of ideology in China today. If you are going to be linking the entire notion of ideology with development, I mean, this takes you back to the framework that Deng Xiaoping set out. where he says that socialism cannot be built in conditions of poverty. So first we have to reach the standards of the capitalist countries in every respect, where therefore Professor Zhuang's points about technology and talent and so on. So you have that, and which you brought in as great power ambitions. So in one sense, the socialist modernization equated with rising to the levels of capitalist development are now being, in one sense, grafted onto great power ambitions. So somewhere, despite this narrative of the socialist modernization in all respects and national rejuvenation, it quite appears that the core, which is you're saying about participatory democracy or about egalitarian objectives or about transformation that was kickstarted in 49, all those seem to be at the moment set to one side, because the entire country has to be geared to actually facing, preparing themselves for the challenges that now are being posed by external forces in the way of their development. I mean, one very strong debate, for instance, inside China is how the United States is actually now determined to stymie China's growth. So in that sense, it adds to the tools that Xi Jinping has to use to exercise even greater control to deal with these challenges. So it does appear that the whole discussion on ideology now has to be put into a very different framework insofar as China is concerned. No talk of the traditional core of, say, Marxism, Leninism, Mao Zedong thought, even Deng Xiaoping theory. No mention of class struggle, no mention of some of these core beliefs which were instrumental in the creation of a new society and so on. So what I basically, it occurs to me that we are looking at a very pragmatic, I mean, even more pragmatic orientation than Deng Xiaoping, if you will, to ideology in the Xi Jinping new era. So just some broad remarks, and I think it's time to open up the floor. Anushka, how do we do this? Shall we go by the list of questions that came up and the order of precedence, in other words, whoever raised their hands first and then the chat box? Because I do remember that, I noted that it was Prabir Chakravarti who raised his hand in the first 5 minutes of Shannon's presentation. So I think we can start there. So will you then take over this business of identifying who came first and reading out the questions?
Sure, of course, ma'am, I'll do that. As of yet, we don't have any questions in the chat box, but I'd like to request and in fact encourage the participants to ask questions to the speakers. In the meantime, I'll take the question from Rapai Maliakal, who's virtual hand is raised.
Sorry, Anushka, as I said, Prabir had raised his hand first. So let's give him the floor first and then go with Rapai ji and other people who have raised.
Sure. So if Mr. Prabir Kumar Chakravarti would like to ask his question, I'd like to give the floor to him.
Okay, thank you, Anushka. I hope I'm heard. It's a very simple question. It's both to Shannon as well as to David. Now, the issue which I would like to focus on, they've spoken on everything. And I think I agree with Professor Alka Acharya that pragmatism is really the key word today. All the ideologies have possibly been put into the back burner. And I want to ask, with regard to this age factor, an Australian Prime Minister has written a book, former Prime Minister, and he gives another 15 years to Xi Jinping, well before the conference. Now, I want to ask about the Central Military Commission to Shannon. I find that the leader is already 72, the vice chairman, one. And the second question is about Taiwan. I think China doesn't believe in actually moving its forces to Taiwan. It believes in creeping. It has crept into some of our areas. It has crept into the South China Sea. It has crept into Hong Kong. It has crept into Macau. I think Taiwan also, they may be making some statements to David here and there. Ultimately, China is going to creep in. What are your views? I would request any of these panelists to take on.
Yeah, I can start. The question about the Central Military Commission, as you noted, one of the vice chairs of the Central Military Commission is 72. If you're looking at Xi Jinping breaking norms, that's actually the most egregious example, because the general retirement age for a Chinese Communist Party member is 68. So he is well past his prime by that metric, but he was brought on again, which suggests that this is a man who has extremely close family connections with Xi and is very trusted by Xi Jinping. That might also tell us that Xi is less comfortable with the alternatives, that the younger military officers are either seen as not as experienced. Zhang actually had experience in China's last conflict, the Sino-Vietnam War, which has, been quite a long time since the 1970s, and anyone since then does not have that experience. So is it that important for Xi to have someone with actual combat experience in office? Is it just the family connections? Does he believe that the younger cadre of officers he's been trying to put in place haven't made it up the ranks enough to reach that level? All of these are going to be interesting factors to watch. But of course, ultimately, Xi Jinping himself is the chair of the Central Military Commission. So he still has tight control over the military. I'm sure David would like to chime in on Taiwan. I myself don't believe that an invasion is imminent, but I also think you have to take seriously Xi Jinping including reunification on Taiwan, talking more directly about it. I've written some about this in the Diplomat if people are interested, that he's changed the focus from saying China will resolutely resist separatism and independence, although of course China will continue to do that, to saying China is going to actively move toward reunification and putting more stress on that, which increases the pressure for him to show results. And what that will look like, I think, is very much open to debate and should be watched with some concern by the international community.
I would just add, for me, the big question has always been whether Taiwan actually takes steps towards independence. That Xi can live with for a fair period of time, though I think Shannon's point is well taken on the shift, but I think Xi can live for relatively, I mean, especially if he's going to plan to be around for another 10 to 15 years, he's got time. But Pelosi's visit looked like it was strengthening the hand. I mean, there really seems to be some concern that the hand of separatists or independents is strengthening in Taiwan, which I think Tsai Ing-wen is doing a terrific job of not doing that. But the next leader of the DPP could, and that could mean that when she steps down, the next round of elections could be a problem. But I think that, I don't think they really, I don't see that they're going to go and invade. On the question of creeping, I just think that the Hong Kong is more than just a little creep. I think that they've stepped in seriously and dismantled the entire opposition. You have to see it that way, totally dismantling the opposition and introducing laws that really stifle, though it's not creeping in the sense of they didn't send the PLA in, but they certainly did send the security forces in. And that's, they're not actively going around and arresting everybody, but they've certainly dismantled the opposition completely. So I think that's to the specific question.
Thank you.
Oh, can I just add one other thing, which I think is really ironic? I'm sorry, I can't. We're all talking about pragmatism, and yet this is a leader who seems to have talked more about ideology and introduced more about ideology than any leader in such a long period of time. So I just wanted, after Manu's points, just want to throw that out there, you know, as a contradiction or irony that everybody's talking about this, you know, this pragmatic leader, and yet, boy, he sure talks a lot about ideology and insists that everybody study, you know, and that study groups are back, and everybody's studying Xi Jinping thought, and in the universities you can't. There's lots of things you can't say. There's all kinds of stress in universities and units. You know, I mean, even Hong Kong. It's ideology. So I don't disagree that it's pragmatic, but I'm just throwing that out.
Thank you so much, Professor Schweg and Ms. Shannon Tiezzi, for your.
I will come to this pragmatism point a little later. Let's take some more questions. Yeah.
Thank you so much, sir. The next question would be from Mr. Rapai. May I please request you to unmute yourself, and please keep your questions a little brief and targeted to the speaker you would like to ask your question to, since we're running out of time. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Anushka. I will not take much time. Only 2 points. One is, when I felt that Xi Jinping's overall strategy, it seems to be not a competition with America directly, but rather he wants to go back to the old glory of China and try to see that can he restore the position China enjoyed before the 17th century. That is point one. Secondly, I think already Shannon made that point about the military commission. So I think age is not a big criteria, but it is what he can get out of is the people he chosen. Finally, about the Taiwan, my question to David is, you have to look at the two aspects. One is the military power of Taiwan itself. I don't think China want to destroy Taiwan and take it. So rather they want to take it as an economic entity. And the economic interactions between Taiwan and mainland, what happens to that investments and the forces which work? DPB may be making more noises, but how you look at the developments in the future? Thank you.
Maybe Professor Mohanty can take the question on ideology. And
yeah,
then,
but if there are more questions, let's take all the questions at once, and then maybe we will come at the end, if there are more questions.
Actually,
sure.
Quickly sum up the questions in the chat box, because there are quite a few now. And what I am going to do is I'm going to just quickly make a reference to the issues that are being raised by the questions. And what I will now request, since we are now running into the last kind of thing, that each of the speakers take the questions and address them in the last 3 minutes that I will give to each of the speakers. So there's one more hand here, which is Kamal Madishetty. So you please very quickly ask your question, and then I will give out the questions in the chat box. Yes, Kamal.
Thank you, Professor Acharya. So my question is to the panel in general. So some accounts of the 20th Party Congress seem to suggest that she has sort of emphasized on livelihoods more than GDP growth itself. So I just wanted to ask, how do you expect this sort of tension, if it exists, between pursuing, redistribution and welfare on one hand, with the GDP growth and its numbers on the other, especially in the context of the last couple of years, where we've seen things like common prosperity become very prominent? Thank you.
All right. So on that common prosperity, Manu, I think when you're addressing pragmatism, you please take this common prosperity. Even Professor Schweg has raised common prosperity as where is its concept, so on. There is a question by Aishwarya about women and how women are now, where are the women? So what do we make of that? Aram says that Aram's question is to Professor Mohanty about again referring to the pragmatism, and her point is that do you think this may be the beginning of the end of socialist ideology in China? And she says about that when she was in China, many of the Chinese citizens did not believe in the CPC ideologically. And even those who joined did it for professional promotions. And once again, another question on pragmatism. And Ambassador Nambiar is talking about the dominance of the Hans and how Xinjiang and Tibet would obviously emerge as major challenges as China pushes its BRI on. So now I will request the reverse order, Professor Mohanty, and then Professor Zhuaig, and then Shannon. Please, 3 minutes each, and let's wrap up.
Thank you. Now, pragmatism and ideology, they are not contradictory. I think that's my first statement. Because, you know, Mao Zedong was both a pragmatist and highly ideological. Deng Xiaoping was a pragmatist, but also ideological because he brought elements of market and liberalism as well as several capitalist instruments, but redefined, socialism for China in a certain way, but was very, very clear that the goals of the Tiananmen Democrats or Tiananmen rebels were not acceptable. And he fired 2 general secretaries and so on. We know that. So please understand, Xi Jinping has emphasized Marxism, has restated the significance of the ideological tradition of China. Mao Zedong thought, Deng Xiaoping theory, Jiang Zemin, the theory of 3 represents, and scientific outlook on development of Hu Jintao are all restated. But he wants to say that he is taking ideology of Marxism to a new stage, and whole party has, accepted that. And as I said, in each sector, there is a Xi Jinping line, and that is highly pragmatic, yet a very clear line that this is permissible, this is not. And what is not permissible is anything that will, say that the Chinese system of socialism is no socialism, or China, for example, in Xi Jinping era, for the first time, there is a clear statement of viability of the Chinese system. You have to believe in the Chinese system of rule of law, the Chinese system of party governance, the Chinese system of handling ecological questions, and they are prepared to learn from the whole world. But then there is a Chinese system. This is the first point. Don't put ideology and pragmatism as adversaries. As contradictory to each other. Mao's ideology, like Xi's ideology, is very responsive to concrete conditions. And I think Shannon's example of Li Qiang was a good point to illustrate that. Now, it's very interesting. A socialist thinker, if we call Xi Jinping for a moment that, talks about Chinese tradition and culture being the basis of Chinese socialism. There is a whole section on that. That there are many, fine traditions in Chinese civilization and culture which are to be used to practice Chinese socialism. So that is the way, the Xi Jinping thought is being formulated. But as Aram has rightly noticed, I have noticed these debates. I'm sure David must have noticed it even more. that there are debates on each of these Xi Jinping lines. We all remember the 100 intellectuals memorandum, and there are many memoranda, many debates. In other words, each one of these is, as I said earlier, is geared towards making China also a great power. And therefore, I would say in answer to the question about common prosperity and how it is opposed to GDP-centric growth model, 6 to 7% growth for a 18 trillion economy is not small growth rate. Would they settle for 2, 3, 4% growth rate? No. So the high quality growth, and you notice during the last 1 year even, they had to go for some even more coal mine. They closed some coal mines, but they opened some more. That's also to be noticed. So this kind of contradiction you'll see, and therefore a certain growth that makes China compete with the United States, compete with what they call the global West. Now, this is the term which is used in the Chinese press, the global West, like the global South. They want to compete with the global West. So the growth rate, military strength, technological superiority, R&D, already their investment in R&D are the highest in the world. Therefore, one has to see that talking is one thing, but practice is the sole criterion of truth, has to be meant differently in real practice. Yes, on women, there is a lot of gap. I think gender inequality is very sharp, and that has been one of the neglected dimensions in the Xi Jinping era, even though there is lip service and there are many women-related programs, no doubt. But the fact that there is no woman in this time in the leadership is very, very telling. And ethnic superiority of the Hans is there to see, and the way the hesitation to share political power with Uyghurs, with Tibetans is very clear. No amount of economic development and cultural concession can fulfill the political aspirations of the Tibetans and the Uyghurs. Therefore, these are very, very serious problems that they have to answer.
Thank you, Manu. Professor Jwaik?
Sure. The question on what's happening across the Taiwan Straits. There's a recent study by the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS, by Scott Kennedy, where they went and interviewed Taiwan, Taishan businessmen in the mainland, and they're moving out. They're moving their capital. They're relocating. And so I think that that's a possibility. There weren't many other, the common prosperity, I think socialism, I think that Manu, that's really something that, and the question of redistribution with growth, it's a contradiction. Mao said contradictions are everywhere, right? And so that's really something that they have to try to balance, I think. And part of the idea of common prosperity is to take down the big capitalists, right? And I think that's still part of his goal is to, he took down the big private businessmen and is, for the small and medium businessmen, which he talks about in the speech, they're going to still insert the party in there. I actually wanted to use my chance to raise 2 points with Shannon, and I'll end here. One is, it's not a critique. I think it's in some ways, wow, we shouldn't be surprised that Xi Jinping came in and just whitewashed everything and put in his own people. If you look at the pattern of leadership transition in China, the first time you come in, the first 5-year plan, the first 5 year of leadership, you're surrounded by people you don't know or you certainly didn't put there, right? If you look at everybody who's come into power, right? Jiang Zemin, Hu Jintao, and then Xi Jinping in 2017, right? Or in 2012. Then by the time the next 5 years roll around, you've sort of squeezed out some of your big opponents, and you've started to bring in some of your own people, which I think Shannon said, starting to bring in his own people, but you really haven't secured total control. This is the first time we've had a guy do this for the third term. And so by the time he gets to the third term, he's just been able to wipe everybody out, right? And nothing was more obvious than sort of however you interpret Hu Jintao getting up and leaving the room. So, and as you say, you know, Wang Yang should have been there. Hu Qinhua just gone. It's really quite amazing, but it's the third term. And so it's a new pattern. It's one more step than I always liked wrote about the first and second term. The other thing is, I think when you talk about factionalism, there used to be a famous article by Gabriel Sartori called Concept Stretching in Social Science. And I think the definition now that you're using of factionalism, or that this professor at American, that somehow that disagreements within the party are going to form into factions. That's not what factionalism is. Factionalism comes back from the idea of a long history together of different people who have had different experiences, who have different policy planks, and I think serious differences. And I think that it's going to be a while before we see factions coming back. This guy's just not going to let it happen anyway.
Right, thank you. That's a sobering thought, but yes, I think these redefinitions of key concepts need to be examined further. Shannon, you have the last word, after which Anushka will give us a vote of thanks.
Sure. I'll start with the point on factionalism. Of course, you're right. This is going to be a long-term process. If we're imagining Xi Jinping is in office until 2035, he's going to start to get older. He's going to be more limited in how much he can directly control. And again, I'm thinking about this in the context of what we saw under Mao Zedong and Deng Xiaoping. The factions emerged basically based on personal political ambitions. People are going to be jockeying to get a slice of the pie, and the pie that is not directly under Xi's thumb, which is very, very small right now, is going to start to get bigger as his capacities inevitably diminish, because he is still human, right? That's the great limitation for Xi Jinping. So I think this is something to watch. Xi Jinping has ended factionalism as we knew it, but just based on the history of the Chinese Communist Party, it's going to come back in some form or another among the people that he has already promoted, because they're in the best position to form their own factions now. I wanted to talk a little bit about the question about competition with the US. I think I'm forgetting now who the questioner was. I apologize for that. But the point raised that China's ultimate goal is to return to what it sees as its rightful place in the world. Think about during the Ming Dynasty, when China was really a major global power, if not the major global power. That's accurate. But China itself views US dominance of the current world order as a direct obstacle to reaching that goal. And there is a major ideological component of that, to bring in that thread we've been talking about again. There's a reason that China is now being very vocal about defending itself as a democracy, right? And they're not saying we reject the idea that democracy is the pinnacle of political systems. They're saying, no, we actually are a democracy, and we're a better democracy than the United States and Canada and Europe and India. All of the more classical examples of democracy that actually involve electing leaders from amongst different political parties. So I think there is an ideological component, there's a pragmatic component that China believes it cannot return to its former glory fully unless it overcomes the obstacle that is the United States. And one point that I didn't raise, but I think has not gotten the attention it deserves, is that the recent Party Congress work report dropped this phrase, that China is in a period of important strategic opportunity for development that had been around since 2002. And that is not the case anymore. China no longer believes that the current trends in global politics are ultimately conducive to its continued rise. It believes quite the opposite, in fact. And so that is going to be a major change in how China relates to the world and how it goes about pursuing its diplomacy. Xi Jinping thought on diplomacy is ultimately confrontational because she sees a world that is trying to hold China down and reject China's progress. And one final point on the lack of women, the lack of other ethnic groups. I think it's very notable that this Politburo is Xi Jinping's men, and they are literally Xi Jinping's men. They are ethnic Han men. It's very telling that he didn't have amongst Xi Jinping's loyalist camp a single woman that he could trust to bring into this group. His vision for China is ultimately a chauvinist one. It's a Han chauvinist, it's male chauvinist. And alternative perspectives and identities, whether that's gender identity, including not just women, but also gay rights, lesbian rights, even just alternative ways of envisioning male identity are not welcome. Certainly alternative ethnic identities, even if you say, well, I'm Chinese, but also Tibetan or Uyghur, is not welcome unless you're embracing the Han identity that Xi is putting forward as well. And that's something that we're going to have to pay attention to as Xi, continues his leadership streak, possibly for another 15 years.
Thank you. Thank you. We've run out of time. Absolutely. Anushka, please step in.
Thank you so much, ma'am. With this, we come to a very ending to the curtain raiser for the 15th AICCS. I express my sincere gratitude to the chair.
Anushka, you are absolutely you are not at all clear, Anushka. I think let's your connection, I think, maybe has a problem. So so let me then, on behalf of everybody at the ICS, express my grateful and very, very appreciative thanks for a fantastic panel discussion. And this curtain raiser to the AICCS is really a very, very promising one. We look forward to you all joining us in the sessions that begin from tomorrow. And thank you once